The final episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender is the highest rated episode in the entire series at 9.9 on IMDb, and yet, despite this, it has one of the most controversial decisions in the whole story: energy bending. Aang is getting his ass kicked by the Fire Lord until there's a magic rock which unlocks the Avatar state, and we enter the second phase of the Dark Souls boss fight. It feels like the dilemma at the heart of the climax is meant to be Aang choosing between his air-nomad, non-violent values and his duty as the Avatar to save the world and kill Ozai, but instead, Aang turns blue and just magics the bending out of him.
I took his bending away. Wow.
Yeah, I didn't see it coming either. Is this a genius stroke of character writing or Deus Ex Machina? Tell me down below. Deus Ex Machina is when something which is not set up, often a character or a power, resolves a problem in the plot in a way which feels unearned and does not create more issues. Energy bending certainly feels like that looking back. It's poorly explained, kind of comes out of the last episode, maybe the last 3 episodes at best, and seems to sidestep the entire dilemma Aang has been forced into. It is, as you could say, a lion turtle did it. The better question is, does that mean the ending sucks? And if not, then why do people still love it? But to really understand energy bending, I think we need to break down the final battle between Ozai and Aang as a whole, which I've never done before. But first, I want to show you something really cool. I've spent a lot of my career talking about writing and magic and fantasy and Avatar, which you know if you followed this channel, but you may not know that I've also spent a lot of my career writing professionally for fantasy games and publishing my own fiction, stuff on the side I don't necessarily talk about. And that's great, I loved that, but I wanted to do something bigger. So, dear friends, viewers, people who just love fantasy and magic and Avatar, this is that. This is Labyrinth. Imagine a world where art is magic and where magic comes from this gargantuan jellyfish in the sky. This is the world of my epic fantasy story, and you can read it in Labyrinth. Except, what's even cooler is it's not just me. I brought together some of the biggest names in epic fantasy with amazing stories and art of their own, broadly themed around the fantastical creatures we all know and love. Dragons, direwolves, bizarre eldritch beasts, and I didn't just want it to be a good book, but a beautiful book for your shelf. It comes with these beautiful illustrations, which I can't show you right now, but I can show you this. I mean, just look at this gorgeous cover art by the incredible artist Andrew Thompson, and this is just the start of the art Labyrinth will have. We launch on Kickstarter soon. 500 people have already signed up for day 1 of the campaign, and I have barely even talked about it. But I want your help to get that number up to 1,000, 1,500. We can do that. Just go to the link down below and sign up to get notified for when it launches. Getting in early comes with perks. I'll be signing Labyrinth copies, and hear me out, but if a mere 1% of the HFM community backs this Kickstarter, we will blow past our stretch goals to bring on more amazing artists and writers. It's called Labyrinth Volume 0 because we can build Labyrinth into something as a community to do more volumes in the future, publish more people, more artists. I want Hello Future Me to be a place we don't just come to learn, but to create. If you have a passion for writing, storytelling, art, which I guess you do, this is how we get to do that. And I haven't even told you all the extra cool secrets yet. Watch out for those soon. Be part of the 1%, join the Kickstarter down below. Let's do this. And if you're watching this video later than when it releases, then it's probably already out right now. Go get it, go back it. Let's talk about energy bending. Part 1, the dilemma. The dilemma of choosing between Aang's air-nomad values and his duty as the Avatar goes right back to the beginning of the series. Aang's reluctance to embrace the Avatar state is rooted in how violent he knows it makes him. To him, it is the worst, angriest, uncontrolled, unmeasured, and darkest parts of himself made manifest. He who becomes divine judgment. The second season opens with Aang having nightmares about seeing himself as this vengeful god instead of a caring, empathetic friend who solves problems by talking. Each season even brings this dilemma to the forefront in their climax in a new way. In the first, we have Aang realizing just how deadly he can be by merging with the ocean spirit, who literally is a vengeful god. In the second season, Aang is told to let go of not only Katara, but of his attachment to the world in order to master the Avatar state. To become, well, we're not entirely sure, but it might have made him some kind of higher ascendant Avatar who thinks on a higher plane of existence to the average human. This is really interesting because Aang views his attachment to the world as a strength. It's that he sees the best in everyone. He gives everyone a second chance. He's very empathetic and grounded, and he gets people, and he always sees a different way forward. Not only is Aang the last survivor of the air nomad genocide, but he finds himself the sole representative of their culture and their values. If he doesn't live them out, they die with him. The last gasps rising from the graves of 10,000 souls breathe down his neck. When Guru Patik asks him to detach himself, this would be the equivalent of letting go of that past, that identity, something he refuses to do. In fact, the show even explicitly likens his love to Katara to his attachment to his people, that it's a new form of that kind of love. He only embraces the Avatar state at the end of season 2 to save his friends, and it doesn't end well. In a sense, he chooses his duty as the Avatar twice, and he's not convinced that this was actually the right answer. And then in season 3, the dilemma becomes very explicit. We get the Day of Black Sun, where people are telling him that he needs to kill the Fire Lord right now, it's super important, and then he's asking past avatars whether he should kill, whether he should forsake his values, and even the Air Nomad Avatar says, yes, you should, that he has a duty to. In the Southern Raiders, Aang goes out of his way to tell Katara to forgive her mother's killer and move on. But even though Katara doesn't kill Yon-Ra, this is not a narrative confirmation that Aang is right here, that actually forgiveness is the only way, and that being not violent and pacifist, that's the only way we solve problems. The episode is very explicit. Katara does not forgive him, and she doesn't know if she was too weak to kill him or if she was strong enough to resist, but she's not persuaded by Aang's argument here. The story over and over presents us with a world which is determined to solve its issues with violence. This is a world which has been at war for 100 years, and from which all violence begets more violence and oppression. This is Jet saying killing is the only way. This is Hama, the puppet master, taking revenge. This is Katara facing down against Yon-Ra. A world which people tell Aang has no place for his values, and Ozai is a villain designed specifically to complicate that dilemma. Aang opens the battle begging him not to fight, but Ozai is not so much a character as a force of evil nature. He cannot be reasoned with. Aang cannot wait for him to make a mistake the way he does with other villains. Ozai is the obstacle designed to force Aang's dilemma to its most extreme. And with the dilemma set firmly in place as the show heads for its final battle, this creates a problem thematically, because, hear me out, let's look at what the actual solutions are to this problem. Number 1, Aang kills Ozai and does his duty. Thematically, this would basically be saying, yeah, killing is pragmatic, and this is a world in which you and your people do not belong, that your values do not belong. They are naive. In fact, Ozai says this during the final battle.
You're weak, just like the rest of your people. They did not deserve to exist in this world, in my world.
Oh, it's not wrong, it's just strange for the character. In a sense, Ozai would just be like, right, and I get why people are drawn to this option, why they think this maybe should have been the climax. Maybe they think it's more realistic or whatever. It would be a pretty grim ending for a series which has deplored violence so far. 2, Ozai kills Aang. I'm just gonna put this down as not particularly workable. 3, Aang stays true to his values and doesn't do his duty, allowing Ozai to keep killing people, which is also just not really workable. And then 4, Aang keeps his values and he stops Ozai, but then the whole dilemma, like the whole kind of narrative momentum leading up to this, feels like a little bit of a lie, feels maybe like we're a bit being cheated. And here's the tricky thing, because like energy bending being another way is because the writers wanted to make a point that the dilemma was not real, it was never real, that it was a false dichotomy, that this is the invention of a world which has convinced itself violence is the only answer, and Aang is actually right. Aang is correct that there is always another way. This is something which Sokka, who has grown up in a world torn apart by war, struggles to understand. Same with Zuko, but Aang is from a different world. In fact, they're very explicit about all of this in the novelization, that there is always another way. Something Aang keeps telling people throughout the series. It doesn't have to be a choice between killing and doing nothing. Aang is what you might call a bit of a paragon character. He transforms others around him through his moral fortitude, and the world tries to break him. His contest is with the world around him. But the problem is that all of this is being transliterated onto introducing a new power we haven't seen before in the climax. And I think a lot of people didn't fully buy that revelation, that the dilemma wasn't real. Introducing a third way that like anyone could take is, I think, mechanically different to inventing a new power to create that third option. I will say, technically, energy bending doesn't solve the problem Ozai poses as a threat. Aang still has to beat him with it. And we see Aang almost fails. You know, if we think about Deus Ex Machina as something which robs a scene of tension, there is still some kind of tension there in its own way. It only resolves Aang's dilemma, but still, I've seen people argue that like energy bending is good and it's really compelling because it represents the core theme of the series, and it is a good message. It's even the most important message. It's sort of saying, yes, it is Deus Ex Machina, but it's actually good Deus Ex Machina. You can have that argument if you want. that doesn't necessarily interest me. The problem being that being thematically coherent is not the same thing as being plot coherent. You set up plot and theme in very different ways. You know, when you're designing the plot and the story, you're using foreshadowing and kind of setup and payoff, scene structure and Chekhov's gun, and like fast and slow pacing to create a feeling in the story. And all of that builds together a level of like story coherence, narrative coherence, plot coherence. Theme, you know, is a little bit more nebulous because theme emerges from how characters face problems and the consequences of doing so, how all of these things sort of interact to create a sense of an understanding of certain concepts and certain ideas. You're using symmetry and motifs and symbols, and all of these interweave to create a sense of how the themes are meant to work. And you can have something which works very much on the plot level, but like muddies what you're saying thematically. And you can have something which very much works on a thematic level, but muddies what happens on a plot level. And I think that that is kind of the issue that we're facing here. In fact, this was famously the problem with another show called Evangelion, where the final episode is deeply metaphorical and it resonates a lot with the core themes of the series. But it feels like it kind of comes a little bit out of nowhere on a plot level. You've got that thematic coherence, but not necessarily that plot coherence. And people just didn't like it.
Maybe I could love myself. Maybe my life could have a greater value.
Congratulations! Congratulations! Congratulations!
Congratulations!
Congratulations.
You know, people very much admire it now because of its complexity. There's sort of a cult following towards it, but that understanding really only emerged a long time after, and it's still controversial. Enough so that the creators actually brought out a film after the series ended, which expanded the ending to make it make plot sense as well as thematic sense. And saying this also doesn't solve the problem of energy bending feel like it was a little unjustified as a power, that you might have been promised something else. Others also argue that like it's not Deus Ex Machina because the lion turtles were hinted at multiple times throughout the series, but no, the lion turtles were foreshadowed, the energy bending was not in a meaningful way. But I also don't think it's as bad as some people say. So let's break it down. Part 2, Aang versus Ozai. The fight can sort of be split up into 4 phases. 1, Ozai on offense, Aang on defense, and it culminates in a really great moment where Ozai shoots lightning at Aang, who then redirects it and has the opportunity to straight up end the fight right here and then. This would be what we talked about with option 1. I actually really love the detail they went to show the expression on Ozai's face. This is really the only time we see fear or even anything human in Ozai, and I think it really matters that Aang is the one who sees this, who notices this, because Aang's strength is in seeing the humanity in others and seeing kind of another way and not letting the dehumanizing violence consume him. But then we go to phase 2 because Aang does not kill Ozai and lets it go somewhere else. And Aang is getting his ass kicked here. He's been beat. He's almost dying. Almost. And that ends with the magic rock, which unlocks the avatar state and lets him curb stomp Ozai, which is phase 3. Now, I've seen people describe the magic rock as Deus Ex Machina. In fact, over the years, I've seen people kind of talk about the rock being more the problem than energy bending itself. I am just not so much convinced by this. We've already seen that being in the avatar state does not make Aang invincible. It doesn't make him invulnerable. And to me, it was just a really interesting development in the fight because the dominant experience throughout that third phase to me is still like, wow, I don't know how this is going to play out. It still felt very tense, especially because for me, I didn't see just getting access to the avatar state as something requiring character development. To me, mastering the avatar state is something that requires character development, and that's not what we're really seeing here. Because an important part of Deus Ex Machina is it doesn't create more problems for your characters. And yeah, the magic rock here does solve one issue, but it makes the dilemma worse. Aang is not in control of the avatar state here. We see Kyoshi's ruthlessness, Roku's desire for justice, Yang Chen's decisiveness. We hear them speaking through him.
You and your forefathers have devastated the balance of this world.
For me, I imagine it almost like the One Ring, where Aang sort of has to resist the pull of the power he has in his hands at this moment. It makes resisting killing Ozai, option 1, even harder. This is not Aang mastering the avatar state, this is him giving into it. In a sense, in both of these 2 phases, Aang is not in control, first of the fight, then of himself. I see it more as the tension shifting to a different problem rather than solving one, especially considering on some level you kind of know that Aang's gonna beat Ozai. The only question is like how much of him gets out of this doing it? How grim will that moment have to be? And especially because we've already seen Aang nearly win on skills alone. But of course, Aang does not kill Ozai. At the last moment, he exits the Avatar state, and that brings us into Phase 4, Energy Bending.
No, I'm not gonna end it like this.
Energy bending is one of the weaker elements of the ending, but something I think which is often lost in this discussion is how many of Aang's other skills, which are foreshadowed and are well set up, play an important role in Ozai's defeat. We have that moment where Aang redirects lightning, and we see Aang use Toph's blind earthbending skill in order to anticipate, predict Ozai's movements so perfectly that he can paralyze Ozai on the ground. We see him rely heavily on fire and earth at the end, his worst elements. All of that is really well set up and interesting to watch. Virtually everything up until this point in the battle is really tense and fascinating, with moral and character dimensions that are pretty much flawless, especially because it's a recurring trope in the series that the villains are overwhelmingly reliant on raw power, while true power lies in learning from others, taking from other cultures and other people. This is lightning redirection based on a water-bending ability, which allows Zuko to save Katara, who defeats Azula, and this is Aang using Toph's abilities. That's great. In a very real sense, this is the power of friendship ending. But part of what makes those skills great is that we understand them. We know how they work, what they mean, and thus how they can fail. And that is where tension comes from, the knowledge that it can fail and how. Aang redirecting lightning is tense in part because of the moral character choice here, but it's also because we know how dangerous it can be if you get it wrong, which he sort of does, and that actually ends up turning the battle against him. Whereas the dominant feeling while watching Energy Bending is, oh wow, this is really epic and dramatic, but what the hell is this? In fact, Aang didn't even know what he was doing until he got to this moment. He only figured out what the hell the Lion Turtle even meant right here. We know that from the novelization. The Lion Turtle's dialogue about the true mind weathering all lies, and how the true heart can touch the poison of hatred, and how darkness thrives in the void but yields a purifying light, and how they use the energy to bend within themselves, and how his spirit must be unbendable. This is a lot of terminology. It's a lot of words, which at the time, especially if you're processing it very quickly, you can only kind of guess at, you know? In fact, the writers knew they wanted to take Ozai's bending, apparently, from pretty early on, but they didn't know how that was going to work and how they were going to work it in until season 3 was being made. And I think that shows. They describe it as, quote, the souls flipping inside out, a battle of the wills almost, but we don't really know exactly how this works. Like, it's not immediately obvious. We don't know what it would look like if Aang lost here. In fact, this is a very similar criticism to the ending of Legend of Korra Season 2 with the giant spirit mecha fight, which is widely panned as the worst season, in part because of the finale, which is, again, thematically resonant, but plot and power-wise a little bit confusing and maybe a bit over the top. In both, you can kind of understand that there's a battle between good and evil, and you can get a feel for how it's going. Like, there is that tension, whether Aang or Korra are losing or winning through visual and musical cues, but it's certainly not immediately apparent what is happening and how it works mechanically. The bottom line is, even if you can argue that, technically it's not Deus Ex Machina because the dilemma wasn't actually real and it didn't solve the whole problem of Ozai, and there was still tension to play with, which you can be invested in, and all of that is sort of true, it still feels overly convenient because it is still inventing a power at the 11th hour from a literal god. And a lot of that wasn't either successfully communicated or people weren't entirely sold on that being the answer to the dilemma. Especially because regardless of the thematic stuff, the character stuff, people go into finales kind of expecting the characters to sacrifice something. Like, they don't necessarily know or care what it is, but like, they tend to go into it expecting that you can't get out of something like this easily. On the one hand, I think energy bending is a problem of poorly explained exposition that alone muddies how people feel about what we're seeing. I also think it's an issue of thematic communication for all the reasons we've said, where it's easy to miss an important side of why energy bending is there. You could even argue that maybe the show doesn't sell its themes as effectively as it could have. But another side to this is that people do often assume that bittersweet or somber or grimdark endings are inherently more complicated or meaningful or dramatic or interesting or realistic. And so in a sense, people assume the dilemma is real and Aang's values are naive and feel robbed when they're told that the dilemma isn't real because they think that this must make the ending kind of childish, that it makes the solution feel unearned because it's inherently not as meaningful and realistic as like a grimdark ending. Maybe that contributes to the feeling of it coming out of nowhere, the expectations we bring to a story like this. I'm reminded of a quote from Ursula K. Le Guin from The Ones Who Walk Away from Ormelas, and I've read this before. The trouble is we have a bad habit of considering happiness as something rather stupid. Only pain is intellectual, only evil interesting. This is the treason of the artist, a refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain. Many people, like the characters in this world, cynically assume that this is a world where only pain is intellectual and happiness and optimism and finding another way is rather stupid. That might color how some people approach the ending here, how some people approach energy bending. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But the ending still does resonate. You can still watch the finale and still feel incredibly invested and have it feel like a satisfying ending, in part because some of the weaknesses are disguised amongst the flawless final battle with Zula and other beats in Aang and Ozai's battle which really do work. But I think it's also because Aang's energy bending only arises out of a moment where he is in total control. When we think about Deus Ex Machina, we're often thinking about something which turns up at the last moment to resolve the plot while the characters have their backs against the wall. But here, he's confident. He's confident enough to turn his back to Ozai, to close his eyes. He's in control of himself here, of the narrative, and I think that makes it, just on an experiential level, makes it feel different. It would have been pure, unadulterated Deus Ex Machina if the lion turtle showed up out of the blue right here and took his bending, no explanation. On some level, this whole moment still feels right for Aang as a character, even if it's not totally clear what's happening. So I think we give it leeway, on an emotional level. Energy bending is a crack in an otherwise brilliant story, and that's okay. Nothing is perfect. We should be very comfortable with admitting that about stories we love, especially because so much of what we love about a story often comes from ourselves and from the place that we were in our lives when we experienced it for the first time, and the glasses that we viewed it through, just as much as like the inherent quality of the storytelling, of the writing. I think that people often get, caught up in like, this is objectively good writing, when I'm not sure I'm necessarily convinced that's like a thing that we can even necessarily discern very easily. There are lots of stories which I know are deeply flawed on both like plot levels and on thematic levels, but which I still adore. I think that's very human. I think engaging with media on different levels is very important. Maybe there are rose-tinted glasses on all of us, but I'm not sure I can remove them. I know there is sometimes this knee-jerk reaction to try and like cover up the flaws in these stories and to justify them and pretend they're not there and make them seem not as bad as they are, as if it's somehow a moral flaw to like something which is maybe not as technically perfect or morally profound as Dostoevsky, or as if that says anything about your analytical skills or your writing skills, that you enjoy this thing which is technically bad. I think that's just a very stupid way to approach all of this. There is another element here. Energy bending is one of those powers which are a bit narratively awkward, because once you introduce it, people start to wonder, why don't they use this all the time? This is something that Legend of Korra has to grapple with, because if Korra can take away people's bending and give them back anytime, this feels like an easy solution to a lot of problems. So the story has to come up with, moral justifications. Oh, it's an incredible violation of someone else. You see a little bit of this with bloodbending as well. They're difficult to wrestle with, to come up with a concrete answer that everyone is just going to accept. And it is easy to introduce it at the end of the story, like in The Last Airbender, when you get to use it once and then you don't have to worry about what happens afterwards. But it's harder to reckon with how our characters should deal with problems going forward when it's a constant presence in the story. And I'm not sure that the show and the world has quite grappled with that as well as it could have. But I say all of this because I do think energy bending could have worked better than it did. And here's how. Part 3. How energy bending should have worked. 1. Just set it up more. Tell us in the library episode that the old avatars used to be able to take people's bending away, but it was a really dangerous ability to try and people have forgotten how to do it. Have the lion turtle then explicitly tell us that he can take bending away, but it's really risky to try, you know, like you have to get in close, you have to be maybe partly meditating, and so instead, Aang turns up to the fight and he knows he's got this ability, but there are multiple times where he's got to choose between taking the easy way out, like killing him with lightning, or exposing himself and making himself vulnerable in order to try energy bending. And maybe he gives it a go once, fails, but then eventually wins. You introduce an element of risk involved with taking the moral high ground, which Aang wants to. We could even incorporate elements of chi blocking, so maybe Suki manages to teach him that or something. So he has to first chi block Ozai and then seals it with some other bending ability, so it builds on what we've seen. 2. One way to sort of neuter Deus Ex Machina is to make it costly. This means it might come out of nowhere, it might resolve the plot, but it doesn't necessarily feel unearned. So let's say Aang can energy bend, but maybe it costs Aang's airbending in return. This would actually resonate, I think, with the dilemma as well, because it would mean, in a weird sense, Aang stayed true to his people and to his culture and himself so hard that he even sacrifices his ability to live it out himself. Maybe his kids can still airbend, he can still pass on those genes, but he sacrifices his power. And this kind of decision is actually sort of foreshadowed in the first season in the Northern Air Temple, where Aang initially decides to seal the last sacred area of the temple so that even he doesn't get to access it. He cuts himself off from this part of his culture in order to protect it. Or remember the cosmic purple place that Aang goes to in season 2? Maybe part of energy bending means fighting in the spirit world and he accidentally seals himself on the other side. All of these would, I think, neuter the problem behind cost. Or 3, give Aang access to the Avatar state earlier, maybe during the Day of Black Sun when he finally lives up to his duty as the Avatar. So he goes into it knowing he can use that power, but it's risky. He doesn't know if he can control it or himself. Then, by refusing to kill, even inside the Avatar state, he masters himself, masters the Avatar state, becomes a fully fledged Avatar, and then they just restrain Ozai in a similar way to Azula. Because, like, the dilemma doesn't apply to Azula, apparently. I need to point this out. She can just be imprisoned. She can just be taken away, even with her powers, even though she's, you know, almost as powerful as Ozai. They imply that it's because she is redeemable, you know, that she's not like a pure psychopath in the way that Ozai is. But it is something to point out. But what do you think? I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts about energy bending and magic and fantasy and writing. Let me know how you would have dealt with it down in the comments below. And then after you've done that, go join the notification list for Labyrinth so you can be part of that when it launches. It's only going to be for that limited time. Again, if a mere 1% of the people in my audience, hell, if 1% of the people just watching this video join the Kickstarter, this will turn into something massive. The only question becomes, will you be part of that 1%? 500 people already are, but I reckon we can get that to 1,000, 1,500. I don't know how big we can make this. Getting in early means perks. HFM has always been about a passion for writing and storytelling and art, and Labyrinth really grew out of that for me. I cannot wait to share all the extra stuff I haven't even mentioned yet, which is even more exciting, but now it comes down to you. Don't miss out. More details to come. I actually made a video on energy bending like 6 years ago. It's a really bad video. It makes me cringe so much. You don't need to go watch it. But what was even weirder is that I came across a script from like 3 years ago where I talked about energy bending again, except I never made it. I never made it into a video. And so I just found the script fully fledged and it implied that I'd even filmed it. I don't even know what happened to it. Stay nerdy and I'll see you in the future.